Who is really responsible for the 9/11 attacks? Does the story that we've been sold stack up? Does it hold up when you put it under a microscope all of these years later? Our next guest says not even close. Many, many questions about the official narrative around the 9/11 attacks. Kevin Ryan is the foremost authority on what happened that day, is editor of the Journal of 9/11 Studies, a board member of the International Center for 9/11 Justice. And Kevin joins us now. Kevin, good to see you. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
And thank you for shining a light on this story, because the official narrative is one thing, but what really happened that day is a completely other thing altogether, from your years of research, pulling these threads and, doing what, frankly, journalists have not done. And you've done all of the hard work. So I guess let's start with, what are we led to believe about the hijackings of those aircraft? What is the official narrative that started you down this path?
Well, the official narrative of 9/11 is composed of reports by the 9/11 Commission, and then for the World Trade Center, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. But overall, the 9/11 Commission report is seen as the official account for what happened on 9/11. And interestingly enough, it doesn't go into a lot of detail of what happened that day. There's 571 pages, and only about 90 pages of the report talk about what happened that day. The rest is really about the myth of Al Qaeda and what we should do about the enemy, Al Qaeda. So I think most people know that the crimes of 9/11 were blamed on 19 young Arab alleged hijackers. 15 of them were from Saudi Arabia, 2 from the United Arab Emirates, and 1 from Egypt, 1 from Lebanon. And interestingly enough, then that led us to invade Afghanistan and Iraq. But
Right.
these 19 Arab hijackers were said to be fundamentalist Muslims, intent on, paying the United States and the financial world back for crimes against Muslim countries. And ultimately, this report doesn't hold up to even really cursory examination. The report is built on very poor investigative procedures, although they said it was the fullest possible accounting of what happened on 9/11. The truth is they left out a lot of information. They didn't report testimony of people like Sibel Edmonds, the FBI translator, who had a lot to say. William Rodriguez, the janitor at the World Trade Center, who talked about explosions going off in the lower levels of the building. Didn't mention World Trade Center 7 at all. It didn't go into the insider trading that was flagged by the Securities and Exchange Commission. Didn't talk about how the hijackers really were able to commandeer these aircraft. They just appeared in the cockpits and suddenly were able to fly these planes. So, there's a lot about the alleged hijackers, though, that is really important to know. First of all, that they were not fundamentalist Muslims by any means. The investigative journalism that went on, even in the mainstream media after 9/11, in the LA Times and Newsweek and so forth, made it clear that these young men were not fundamentalist Muslims. They like to drink a lot. They like to go to nude bars. These are things that Muslims just don't do. Recently, a great 9/11 investigator by the name of Daniel Hopsicker died, and he did a lot of work to reveal who these alleged hijackers really were, especially in the state of Florida, where they did training at flight schools that seemed to be associated with CIA operations, and they did drugs, and they dated strippers, and they went to the go-go clubs, and so these are not fundamental Muslims. They also were not very skilled, the alleged hijackers. So they did attend here and there throughout the country training schools for asking to train to fly Boeing airliners. And it was clear that they did not do very well, and their trainers were very suspicious of what happened. In some cases, even questioning whether the certificates they had obtained were real. So, and then finally, they could not have accomplished, these alleged hijackers just could not have accomplished most of what needs to be explained. On 9/11, for about 2 hours, our air defenses failed. And for 2 hours, our chain of command failed within the military. And as we know, from a previous guest that you've had on, Ted Walter from our organization, the World Trade Center buildings were demolished. And these 19 young men were just not in a position to pull off all of these crimes. So, that's really the problem. The official accounts are false, and the accused men were not really capable, despite being not who they were portrayed to be, but just not really capable of accomplishing what was said to be accomplished that day.
So what was said to be accomplished that day, Kevin, right, was that they took over the aircraft. They commandeered the aircraft. They had flight skills that they could fly these massive aircraft and direct them into the World Trade Center towers. So you're saying that that's just not possible, that they couldn't have commandeered. Did they even enter the cockpit? How do we know this?
That's a good question. Yeah. The 9/11 Commission did not state how they entered the cockpits of any of the 4 planes. But some of the interesting aspects of this are that, the 4 pilots of the aircraft, the primary pilots were all military officers, former military officers. And one thing we know is that none of the planes squawked the hijack code, which is an automatic response that trained pilots are required to do the first time they have any suspicion of a hijacking. So the 7500 transponder code is the hijack squawk code, and they did not accomplish that. The 9/11 Commission stated that Muhammad Atta and his colleagues expected the cockpit doors to be unlocked and didn't have a contingency plan if the doors were locked, but it was required that the cockpit doors be locked. It's in flight. So, and as I said, there was no real explanation for how any of these men, young men, really all generally slender of build and small of stature, could have overcome these military officers and taken over the plane. So it has not been explained what happened in that regard. There is an alternative explanation, and that has to do with remote guidance technology. And this technology was developed in the years before 9/11. It had been thoroughly tested in the 3 months before 9/11 by Raytheon and the U.S. Air Force at Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico. So they had been testing for 3 months.
Wow.
This technology that allowed that the ground-based controller to take over control of an aircraft, shut off communication from the aircraft, and run a pre-programmed autopilot plan that allowed the plane to fly wherever it should in the country or needed to, and even be landed via very precision technology. We believe more and more that that's exactly what happened.
Wow.
And, the Pentagon, for example, is an example of where it's clear this had to have happened, because the alleged hijacker, Hani Hanjour, is the one that his flight instructor questioned whether his certificate was real and said he couldn't fly a Cessna, but yet he was commandeering this 757 airliner and engaging in some very skilled precision dive and corkscrew turn before hitting the building on the first floor at 500 miles per hour. It's just very unlikely, whereas the guidance technology would explain how this could happen.
I mean, I've got chills. I've never heard this explanation before. I got chills when you said that this could have been directed navigation coming from some nefarious source. Technology developed by Raytheon to commandeer these craft. So let's unpack that a little bit, because in the 9/11 report, they don't make any claim as to how they got in the cockpit. Do we know that they got in the cockpit, or do we have any evidence at all that they ever got in the cockpit?
Well, the evidence is leaked out that supports the official story is leaked out actually over years. Originally, they didn't have much to go on at all. And if I step back and let you know that the 9/11 Commission report was generated by a man named Philip Zelikow, who was a professor at the University of Virginia and known for being a mythologist, which is interesting. But he and his colleague Ernest May generated an outline of what happened on 9/11 before the investigation began. So they had a very detailed outline with section headings and subheadings and sub-subheadings. They kept this outline secret from the rest of the 9/11 Commission. This is well reported in a book by Philip Shannon. Shannon wrote a book called The Commission that was a bestseller, and he talked about this outline that Zelikow and others created. So exactly how they came up with it, we don't know. But some of these headings where we have some planes, the later came out through an article by Vanity Fair that there were tapes that had never been revealed that NORAD had recorded of Muhammad Atta and the others taking over the plane. So, but again, exactly how they got into the cockpit, we don't know, and exactly where these recordings came from and how they relate to what happened, we're not really clear either. But yes, the automated GPS-guided remote technology developed by Raytheon, Lockheed, and the U.S. Air Force was something that took into account the GPS satellite systems, right? The satellites are used for GPS, and it augmented it with a new technology called the Wide Area Augmentation System, which utilized ground-based equipment to further improve the precision of the location and the guidance technology that is used for commandeering an airliner like this, and then flying it wherever it's landing it. There is landing equipment that's involved as well. And personally, I believe that the landing equipment was installed, for example, at the Pentagon in the construction trailers just outside and right inside the renovation zone. The building had just been renovated, and that's another interesting aspect of the crimes.
So we have these pilots, which with very sort of shady ideas about their flight abilities. We have these revelations recently about the CIA association with these pilots. Can you talk about that? And did that shine a light on, did that help what you think happened, or did it hurt what you think happened?
Well, it's another baby step, I think, toward revealing some of the truth. So that news story came about when an investigator for the Office of Military Commissions, Don Canestraro, the military commissions are pursuing the legal actions against the defendants at Guantanamo Bay. So Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, Ramzi bin al-Shibh, those men. So Don Canestraro had an opportunity as part of these trials, or preparation for these trials, to interview a lot of FBI and CIA people. And he got detailed information related to particularly two of the alleged hijackers. Their names were Nawaf al-Hazmi and Khalid al-Madar. These are young men who came to the United States in January 2000 and were immediately met by an interesting character by the name of Omar al-Bayoumi. And so Canestraro talks about how Omar al-Bayoumi was actually a Saudi intelligence officer. Ostensibly, he was listed as a student of 40-something students connected to the Saudi Arabian Cultural Mission. And there's another character, Osama Baznan, who is similar, Saudi intelligence characters. What they did is when these two young men came in January 2000, they set them up in an apartment and they gave them money to live. And they introduced them to an FBI asset by the name of Abdusattar Sheikh, who became their landlord. They lived with him for the remaining period of time leading up to the crime, so almost 2 years. And so these two young men were allegedly not visible to the FBI and CIA, despite the fact that they were, they were supported by CIA-related Saudi intelligence and FBI assets. So the Saudi intelligence officers, according to Don Canestraro and his investigation, were actually also acting on behalf of the CIA, trying to recruit these young men for an operation. Despite that fact, this Abdul Sattar Sheikh was a longtime FBI asset. He engaged in investigations in terrorism for 6 or 7 years with the FBI, and he was housing these two alleged hijackers. So what happened with him was that the FBI denied the 9/11 Commission or the Congressional Joint Inquiry an opportunity to interview Abdul Sattar Sheikh, and they wouldn't even allow the FBI or the 9/11 Commission to interview his FBI handler. So here we are. We've got this guy who is housing these two alleged hijackers, who, by the way, again, were not Muslim type characters. They like to hang out in a nude bar in San Diego called Cheetahs, and according to the flight instructor there in San Diego, Rick Garza, they couldn't even draw an airplane. But yet they were said to be the muscle hijackers on Flight 77, and allegedly perished that day. But when we talk about Abdul Sattar Sheikh and how he was not even allowed, they didn't even allow him to be interviewed. The FBI prevented any interviewing of him. It harkens back to the George W. Bush's claim that, we were going to go after the terrorists and anyone who harbored them.
Right.
Well, Abdul Sattar Sheikh harbored these two young men for the 2 years prior to 9/11, and then he was let off the hook, wasn't even interviewed, was given $100,000, his contract was closed. And so these are inexplicable events that suggest that something was going on there, and there's a lot more about FBI knowledge of the 9/11 attacks that can be said. You may recall David Shippers, who was the attorney that prosecuted Bill Clinton in his impeachment trial.
Right.
Well, he a few days after 9/11, he came out and said that he was given precise details about the 9/11 operation by FBI officers, FBI agents, 6 weeks before it happened.
What?
And he tried for repeatedly to contact John Ashcroft, who was the Attorney General at the time. And Ashcroft wouldn't return any of his calls. And he was obviously, within Republican circles, a pretty well-known guy. He prosecuted Clinton. So anyway, there was clearly knowledge throughout the FBI that something was going to happen, and pretty precise details as well. So, but these young men, they were protected. And that was what we saw throughout the country with these other alleged hijackers. They were clearly protected.
Protected by somebody. So you believe protected by the CIA, protected by the deep state to carry out perhaps a large, massive false flag attack, arguably the largest false flag attack in world history. Is that really at the heart of all of this? This was a massive false flag operation using these men as sort of patsies, cover story for the United States to carry out these attacks?
That's what it looks like. Yeah, it definitely looks like that. These young men were the backstory, and Al-Qaeda itself was the backstory. And I've written a lot about the FBI and the CIA and their leadership, Louis Freeh and George Tenet specifically, and how these men had really facilitated and covered up terrorism in the years before 9/11. And so, yeah, the backstory was the alleged hijackers training at these flight schools around the country. The only evidence of them boarding one of the flights is a video from Dulles Airport related to Flight 77. There were no other closed-circuit TV videos available of the other hijackers, but there is that evidence. And interestingly, these young men were screened repeatedly as if they were risks flight risks, and they were still allowed to get through. So, but yes, it's a false flag operation intended to bring about what a group called the Project for a New American Century had called for just the year before in 2000. They had put out a paper called Rebuilding America's Defenses, and they had called for a catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor that would be needed to galvanize the American public into becoming a huge military increase in military spending and attacks on various countries around the world that just happen to have some of the most strategic resources within their realm. So there were countries like Afghanistan and Iraq attacked, but actually we found out that there were plans to attack those countries before 9/11. This was just giving the justification for doing so. So yes, a false flag attack is what 9/11 was. The 9/11 or the alleged hijackers were, you used the word patsies. I think that's a reasonable description. They were fall guys for a story that really ultimately was conducted by the U.S. military and intelligence apparatus.
So it's weird to wonder, but what do those men think they were doing that day? Did they think they were going to be hijacking an aircraft? Were they being used somehow by the CIA for some other reason, and they didn't know that that day they would be flown to their death? It's interesting to think about.
It is an interesting question, and The Guardian reported afterward that half of the alleged hijackers, well, 11 of them, didn't know that they were going to die that day. So somehow they knew they were part of some sort of operation, but they did not know it was a suicide mission. And according to The Guardian, in any case. But some of them were, clearly kind of mob-like characters. The way they dressed, according to Daniel Hopsicker, he gave a very good description of witness testimony of these guys, and they showed up in the bars, drunken and spending a lot of money. They were wearing silk shirts and gold jewelry and just acting like mafia characters or troublemakers, trying to draw attention to themselves and build that backstory so that it could be used ultimately to establish the official account.
Let's talk about the air defense systems. You touched on it briefly, but a 2-hour window where air defense systems went dark, just failed to operate. What do we know about that? Why would that have happened?
Well, officially, what happened, according to the 9/11 Commission, is there was a breakdown in communication between the FAA and the military, NORAD. And unfortunately, the evidence doesn't really support that. And there are testimonies, for example, from Laura Brown, an FAA administrator, who wrote a memo afterward stating that the FAA was tracking all these planes and the military was in on it. They were also tracking all these planes. But there are a couple of guys at the FAA that were of a lot of interest to me. One of them was Ben Sliney, who was on his first day at the job at the National Command Center for FAA. He was on his first day at the job, and they gave him complete control over what was happening. He had previously spent most of his career as a Wall Street lawyer and just transferred into the FAA a few months before and just started his National Command Center manager's job that day. And he was informed about the first hijacking at 8:15. This was Flight 11, American Airlines Flight 11, which ultimately ended up hitting the North Tower of the World Trade Center. So at 8:15 in the morning, he knew about a hijacked aircraft. And then just to give you the time period, it was like 9:08, 9:07 in the morning, almost 2 hours later, when Flight 93 was said to have crashed. So almost 2 hours between when they knew the first plane was hijacked and none of the planes were intercepted. So when I say intercepted, that means the military jets that are at the ready around the country and do this sort of thing 100 times a year. They actually, for 4 years before, on average, 100 times a year, they intercepted errant planes. All they needed was the communication to be lost, the transponder to be changed, or the flight path to change. If any of those things happens, then military jets would automatically scramble. And none of that happened on 9/11 as needed. Officially, the first account came from General Richard Myers, who was the acting German Joint Staff, but he said that none of the there were no planes scrambled. Initially, he said 3 days afterward, no planes were scrambled to intercept the flights. And then the second story came out a few months later from General Ralph Eberhart, who was giving testimony to the U.S. Senate Arms Committee. And he said that, yes, in fact, we were notified and we did scramble jets. And we had documented notification of these planes being hijacked. And then that changed a little bit again, and the timeline changed a little bit more, because what was happening is that as information was revealed, military officers and Air Force personnel were all interviewed thoroughly. And it's clear that planes were scrambled. That planes were scrambled from Otis Air Force Base in Cape Cod. Planes were scrambled from Langley Air Force Base in Virginia. And unfortunately, none from Andrews Air Force Base, which is only 10 miles away from the Pentagon. But the problems that arose was that the planes, the interceptor jets, were given the wrong heading. And so they flew out east over the Atlantic Ocean. They were given orders to fly at max subsonic speed, which means subsonic, meaning below just a fraction of their maximum speed. So they're going the wrong direction at a fraction of their maximum speed. And they were not able to catch up with any of the hijacked aircraft.
Did we ever find out why they were given these false directions? Or who issued
there's
the
a
order?
lot of, there's actually the details about where these orders came from and exactly what these false orders were captured in memoranda for the record, which were the documentation that was generated by the 9/11 Commission staff as they interviewed various people related to the 9/11 Commission investigation. So they generated these memoranda for the record, and in these memoranda for the record, they talk about the jets being given the wrong heading. Initially, they say, well, it was important for the takeoffs that they'd be given the slightly different heading. But then the planes continued, the jets continued on this wrong heading over the Atlantic Ocean. So it was not thoroughly explained. But in any case, 4 different accounts. And what's really glaring about this ultimately is that the final account came from the 9/11 Commission, which said that the military had not been notified about any of the planes other than Flight 11, the first one. And so until after they all crashed. So what that means is that, and Philip Zelikow even stated it, the military officers had all been mistaken or lying. For some reason, they are all lying about notification given by the FAA and their response. And they would have to be lying to actually make themselves look bad. So if you think about that, the 9/11 Commission did let them off the hook ultimately with an official report that said they were never notified. But they were notified. And this was, as I said, testimony to the U.S. Senate, documented notification. So there's a lot to be said here, and that would potentially be an opportunity to bring up charges of lying to Congress on behalf of General Ralph Eberhart specifically, if what he said was untrue. But so there's a lot that needs to be sorted out with regard to the response to the alleged hijackings. As I said, though, the remote guidance technology alternative hypothesis would explain a bit more about why all these antics were going on that day.
And it all comes together when you think about the controlled demolition of the Twin Towers, which we've cataloged here in great detail. I encourage people to go watch that interview. We'll link it up here in a card so people can go watch that full interview and deep dive, and Building 7 specifically as well, and that being brought down. and then having this remote access technology that's controlling these aircraft to carry out this cover story. I've been hearing from a number of insiders lately who've been warning and are very nervous about another large-scale 9/11 style false flag attack. And there's rumblings of this, and it's very, very troubling from insiders I've been speaking to. And we're, been hoping to really get the word out about keeping our eyes and ears open to these false flag attacks. You talked about rallying the nation. I mean, I have a close friend, a dear friend of mine, who became a Marine Corps pilot after 9/11 because of what he saw that day. He was like, that's it, I'm going to go and serve my country. So the rallying, the flags on every street, the 92% approval rating for George W. Bush throwing out a pitch at the Yankees game, the rallying around this president, the most popular president of any president in modern American history at that time with an approval rating because of the war, because of this arguably phony false flag attack. I mean, it seems like they carried out their plan perfectly.
Yeah, the costs of the 9/11 crimes are just tremendous. Brown University has put together an estimate of some of the costs that include 4.5 million people killed in the global war on terror, which was initiated based on the 9/11 attacks. $8 trillion in financial costs, $8 trillion. And what people rarely notice is that 9/11 also provided the justification for a huge increase in certain powers, massive increase in the executive branch's powers specifically. So mass surveillance, torture, indefinite detention, the authorization to use military force whenever the president can use military force to this day, whenever he thinks that terrorism might have something to do with what's going on. So Joe Biden has referenced that 2001 authorization for military force in efforts against Somalia. So the president is almost like has become very close to a dictator to some extent, with these powers that were allowed and justified via the 9/11 attacks. So it's really imperative that people learn more about what happened and understand that there are alternative hypotheses for what happened. That's one thing that International Center for 9/11 Justice is focused on. We're focused on research and education. So we're going to conduct more and more of the best research and collate and archive the best research. And we're going to educate people and continue to do so whenever we can, that there are not just questions about 9/11, but alternative hypotheses for what happened that really are supported by the evidence much better.
I'll get you out of here on this, which is the insider trading question. This is maybe the last piece I wanted to touch on here. You mentioned some of the really interesting points about this, all of the insider trading that was happening in the lead up to 9/11 that triggered the SEC. Well, what happened with this insider trading?
Yeah, after 9/11, there were a dozen investigations around the world. A dozen countries opened investigations into insider trading related to the 9/11 attacks. They ultimately all deferred to the SEC and the FBI, but there was a lot of evidence for what looked to be insider trading. People often talk about the put options, which are bets that a company's stock will fall within a certain period of time. And so put options were made against American Airlines and United Airlines, the two airlines that were affected by 9/11. Also, Morgan Stanley, one of the biggest tenants of the World Trade Center towers, was put options were made on that company. There were a lot of other things happening related to financial crimes. There were crimes occurring in the towers, and a German company called Convar was able to confirm this through recovery of the World Trade Center computers. And so, some of the suspects are very interesting to me. One particular is a man named Dexter Walker, who ran the company that oversaw security for the World Trade Center complex. He was one of the people specifically cited by the SEC for having engaged in 9/11 insider trading. And none of the suspects, specific people, were interviewed by the FBI or the 9/11 Commission. The 9/11 Commission just stated that it was not evident to them how any of these people could have been connected to Al Qaeda, so therefore it could not have been insider trading. Well, that's a circular argument, obviously, and it's something that I wrote an article on this that was published in a book by Jesse Ventura and Dick Russell called 63 Documents the Government Doesn't Want You to Read. And it goes into detail about these suspects. Wirt Dexter Walker is very interesting for many reasons. Obviously, putting explosives in the World Trade Center is something that really has to do with access to the buildings, and therefore it has to do with security. And one point I'll make related to the two San Diego hijackers who are news this year, they were managed by these guys from the Saudi Arabian Cultural Mission, which, was a front, I'm sure. But it turns out that Stratesec, the company that Wirt Dexter Walker ran, held its annual meetings in offices leased by the Saudi Arabian Cultural Mission in the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C. So this does connect the possibility for demolition of the World Trade Center to the management of the alleged hijackers through the Saudi embassy, which was at the time run by Prince Bandar. He's also known as Bandar Bush, who later became the head of Saudi Intel. This Stratesec company had their meetings in Saudi offices. The same organization was managing the alleged hijackers.
And so someone decides to dump those stocks ahead of time. Yeah, very, very interesting that they know that this is happening. They know these plans are in place. But it's, again, comes back to how much did they know? How much were they allowed to know, given the fact that the deep state, CIA, et cetera, was running these operations? Do you ever wonder, if you worked at the CIA, like if it was your job to walk in there every day and you walk across that crest of the CIA and you think, you're doing your job and you're helping to keep America safe, like that's your mission, and you're privy to this knowledge that no, the CIA really is in many ways a terrorist organization and is a criminal organization that carries out false flag attacks against the American people, creates coups around the world that lead to the destabilization of the Middle East and Africa and Ukraine and the endless number of these things. Would we have more whistleblowers, more people from the CIA that would come forward and admit these crimes, that maybe they're just not read in on these high-level missions? Or do you think we are hearing more from individuals in a clandestine way? They're coming forward and admitting to these through whistleblower protections, perhaps?
Well, we have heard from a few CIA officers. Michael Scheuer, for example, after 9/11, testified that there were 10 opportunities to capture Osama bin Laden that were all prevented by the CIA's director, George Tenet. And so there are some people who have made some comments that indicate that the CIA knew the attacks were going to occur and let them happen. But my opinion, my experience with people in the CIA, which is limited, granted, is that no one really stops working for the CIA. And I think they're very well convinced that it would be against their best interest and their family's best interest to speak out in any way that would cause any real serious harm to the agency. So that's my personal opinion.
They're lifers, despite them getting out. Well, to ask some of our friends who routinely appear on our show who are ex-CIA, if that's the case. Fascinating. Anything that we didn't cover that you think is relevant to this? Any ground that we didn't cover? Actually, I do have one more question. A lot of people will say, of course, what happened to the Pentagon. We talk about the aircraft flying into the Pentagon at that angle. And you can sit there and look at video after video after video and say to yourself, is that really an airplane? Is that an aircraft that struck the Pentagon? To many eyes, it looks like it's a missile. And what about the trees that were nearby on the way, in the pathway leading to the Pentagon? Wouldn't those trees have been felled as well? Where is the wreckage? Where are the pieces of the wreckage? Where is all of that? Others, there's news reports, live news reports at the time, live television reports saying that they saw no sign of an airplane. and those videos have been really scrubbed from the internet. So what do you say about that, the airplane versus missile theory as it relates to the Pentagon?
Well, we have a number of papers at the Journal of 9/11 Studies that examines that question, what hit the Pentagon specifically, and the flight data path, the flight data recorder data from Flight 77. The best evidence does suggest that Flight 77 was the aircraft that impacted somewhere outside of the Pentagon. Personally, I feel that the aircraft hit the construction trailers just outside of the Pentagon, and I've written a bit about that. But I also think it has a lot to what happened there has a lot to do with the renovation project that occurred, just completed for that one wedge of the 5 wedges of the Pentagon where the plane had hit. So there was a renovation project going on led by Paul Wolfowitz, the Deputy Secretary of Defense. And the plane happened to hit just the one area that had been renovated. And it was something that I feel has something to do with what happened on that day, whether there were explosives involved or guidance technology planted there. I think those things need to be looked into. But yeah, the best evidence that I've seen looks like Flight 77 was the one that impacted, although that discussion continues. And there are a lot of people who believe opposite. So I think that discussion should continue, and we'll find out ultimately in the end where the best evidence leads.
Fascinating. Kevin, where can people read more of your work on this subject?
Well, I've written a book called Another 19: Investigating Legitimate 9/11 Suspects, which is being made available for free at the International Center for 9/11 Justice. So if you go to ic911.org, you can read my book for free. I also have a blog called digwithin.net, at digwithin.net, and where I've got a lot of different articles related to 9/11 research. And of course, the Journal of 9/11 Studies, which is also at the International Center for 9/11 Justice, where I've been the editor for 17 years. So we have a lot of peer-reviewed research that's going to be useful ultimately for any justice that we might be able to bring about regarding the 9/11 crimes.
Has anyone told you to back off this story?
Well, that's not exactly how things work from what I've seen. What happens is that anyone can call themselves a member of the 9/11 Truth Movement. And so infiltration of the 9/11 Truth Movement is the go-to method rather than threats and murder. And you probably know about COINTELPRO back in the 70s against the Black Rights Movement, the peace movement. Those same things happened, in the peace actions related to Iraq and Afghanistan, and they were infiltrators that would come in, and they would say things and do things that would make everybody look a little bit crazy and therefore deter attention away from the questioning. And I think that's really what happens to us, those of us who try to speak out about important power story issues like 9/11.
Fascinating. Kevin, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it. We'll have links to all of your resources in the description below so people can read your book and read your blog as well. And I just want to thank you for your time and shining a light on a huge piece of the story that I didn't ever hear about before. Pieces of it I have, but of course, putting this all together for us has been really, really eye-opening. Thank you so much for your work.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.